One of the funny things about ministry is you can absolutely get a ministry degree with very little exposure to real people. You have a ministry of study, you read countless books, you write countless papers, you read and learn Greek and Hebrew. You are very much a library rat to get a degree that is all about ministering to people. There are certainly ways that schools make their best effort to counteract that. They have practicums and real life experience as part of the core curriculum. That's completely understandable. But by and large, you can go through and get a theology degree in many instances with very, very little exposure to people. And so what you see is that theology degrees often draw the introverts. The degrees that are required to get into some levels of ministry and congregational ministry and certain preaching positions require an awful lot of study, which is not in and of itself a bad thing. It just might lead itself to finding people who are truly out of balance. And I can attest to that because that certainly is where I've come from. In clinical psychology, several decades back, they noticed a very similar problem. They were finding that they were producing researchers who had very little exposure to actual people. They were also finding that they had clinicians who had very, very little exposure to actual research methodology and thinking through things from a research critical perspective. UC Boulder came up with an approach that's appropriately named the Boulder model that takes research and practice, the clinic and the research lab, and it melds them together into kind of a close to a 50-50 combination. So the Boulder model, or the scientist-practitioner model, is one that says a well-rounded clinician or a well-rounded clinical psychologist is someone who knows people in the clinic and they know research, and so that their clinical practice and therapy weighs into their research, it informs their research, and their research focus and methodology is informing their clinical practice, and now all of a sudden you have a very well-rounded clinician and a very well-rounded researcher. We need well-informed practitioners who are theologian practitioners. That means that they are in the Word, they're studying, they're in the commentaries, they have a deep, rich theology, and, this is where it often falls short, even for myself often, that knowledge is brought into real life experience with real people. So that you don't have a minister who's just in an ivory tower who has no exposure to the real world, and you don't have a minister over here who does not have a good, deep, rich, theological, biblical undergirding. We need ministers who are in balance, ministers who understand the riches of study, and ministers who both understand what real people are all about. And if we can train people to be theologian practitioners, it would do our churches an awful lot of good. It would do our scholarship an awful lot of good because we would have theologically informed ministers, people who are actually in the lives of real people, ministering to them, discipling them, counseling them, helping them, who also have a very deep and rich theological practice, understanding, study, spiritual disciplines, etc. If you're a minister out there who's just struggling with one or the other, that you are in the trenches, but you don't really have much time for Bible, or you're in the Word, but you have very little time for people, then we need to think about how to adjust to make those corrections. If you are in church leadership or eldership and you're talking about hiring somebody and you're looking for a certain set of skills, as Liam Neeson would say, then you need to really look at the kind of person you're asking for, because it's really easy in ministry as an introvert to be able to kind of get locked down in an office, myself included, and spend an awful lot of time in study and not enough time with people. And then there are the extroverts out there who are gaining their energy from being around people, who are really spending all their time with people and have very little need for study. I've met both types, and there are strengths and weaknesses of both. You have the very well-loved minister who spends all their time with people but does not have a good disciplined ministry of study. And then you have the very, very disciplined studier, the studious minister, who spends lots and lots of time in sermon prep and original languages and finding good illustrations and diving into the text and all this sort of thing, but has very little time for people, so that whenever they preach or teach, they have very little voice because they don't have much buy-in from the congregation because the people don't really know them. And then on the other hand, you have the person who has a lot of rapport and buy-in with the congregation, but really has very little to say. And so we need well-rounded ministers who kind of get both of this, and personalities tend to push us into one direction or the other, and we need to be aware enough of our own selves to know what our tendencies and propensities are so that we can lean the other direction a little bit harder. And again, for me, I'm the introvert minister who would love to spend all day studying, but I know that's not good for me. It's the very first thing that God said was not good for mankind. It's not good for man to be alone. And so for those of us who are inclined to a ministry of study, and can be a ministry of isolation, it's not a good approach. It's not a healthy approach. I can attest to that. We have to get outside that bubble. We have to get into people's lives. And I will tell you, this is the motivation for doing that if you're an introvert minister. when you get into people's lives and you interact with them and you disciple them, you'll actually have a richer study. For those who are all about people and all about spending time with people, the extrovert minister will actually find deeper conversation with those you are interacting with if you have a deeper ministry of study. The two go hand in hand. We need theologian practitioners. We need our universities to produce theologian practitioners. We need the curriculum to reflect theologian practitioners. We need churches who are looking for theologian practitioners. We need eldership who have that in the job description. This is how we want you to spend your time. Yes, we want well-crafted lessons, but we also want a congregation who is willing to listen because they know you, right? And so that's the balance we need to find. Thank you so much for watching this, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.